Dear writer, you need to quit. This is the show that helps you know what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. My name is Becca Syme, and I'm a Gallup certified strengths coach with thousands of hours of coaching 6- and 7-figure authors, mid-listers, major award winners, and new authors alike because everyone needs to quit something. Anyone can tell you what worked for them, and of course, they say it might not work for you, but they can't tell you why. Well, I can tell you why. Welcome to the QuitCast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 31 of the QuitCast. Today, we're going to be talking about balconies and basements again. So it's going to be another Strengths for Writers topic and specifically focused on development and on addressing some of the questions that have come up since last week, which thank you all so much for those. That was awesome. We had a great discussion. So I want to continue the discussion because I feel kind of like we opened a big squiggly, squirming, moving can of juicy, ripe red worms last week. And I want to do as much as I can to untangle some of that and to hopefully give us some direction about where we're going to go in the future with development of strengths. And if you haven't heard of strengths before, please do check out the links in the show notes. Today, we are going to get a little bit deeper into the topic that we started last week, which is if you assume that strengths is a success metric, then how do you get to that place where you're becoming more and more successful? Well, of course, what you do is you deal with the basement or the hindering parts of your strengths, and you try to spend more time in the balconies or the shiny parts, right? Like we don't want to be held back, we want to shine. And so you spend time specifically targeting and developing yourself out of those basements. You build yourself the stairs, you climb out, you come out onto the solid ground, right? And then you want to get better and better from there. But we're talking a lot about how to identify these basements, how to work out of them. So how do you develop them? And I want to start by saying that this topic is incredibly complicated because you have a combination of different strengths. Your balconies and basements are going to be slightly different from each other. So there were a lot of questions about how to identify our own basements. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. So let me just say first, we're going to address this a lot in the upcoming podcast here. In fact, once we get through the identification phase of the strengths, which is what our first year has become, we're taking each strength as it manifests in writers, and we're talking about how you identify your own behaviors. After the identification is over, it's so important that you don't skip the step of identification and move straight into development, because if you don't know what you're developing, then you're not going to be as good at it. And so this step of identification is super important. We still have 22, I think 21 strengths left. And so we're going to get through those this upcoming year. And then we're going to launch into some pretty serious development discussions because, of course, that's what I get excited about when it comes to strengths, the standout writer. That's the talk that I give. And I want us to spend more time focusing on how do we get to that standout place. Well, first, the first step to doing that is identification of the themes, figuring out, am I in the balcony? Am I in the basement? So I'm going to say it is exceptionally difficult to identify balconies and basements in a vacuum. You can give generic guidelines on this is how intellection typically works, or this is how activator typically works, but you knowing whether you are operating in a basement of a strength is about, is that strength in your way? Is it hindering your development into what could be just standout stellar strength in that area? And that identification can't happen in a vacuum. You can't just look at a list of behaviors and decide, that's me, that's me, that's me, because almost all of those behaviors are subconscious. They're assumptions because strengths are so much about instinct and they're about our first thought. And you'll hear as we go through the identification process, we're going to do 2 examples. You'll hear that those examples are not presenting behaviors. The presenting behavior was a roadblock or it was a stumbling block. It wasn't the, hey, I'm having trouble with my activator. Can you help me with this? It was, let's talk about what is in your way right now. Let's talk about what's keeping you from getting what you want. And then the identification process was for listening to someone talk and hearing the core behavior behind what their roadblock was all about, and then identifying how to fix that behavior. So that process, the listening to someone talk about a roadblock, identifying the core behavior behind where that roadblock is coming from, listening for the instinctive behavior. If you hear me saying, listening to someone, hearing them say, you'll hear like, this isn't a one person process. This needs to happen between you and someone else. It can be a friend. I obviously would always prefer that it was a coach, and we have several certified strengths coaches that I can refer you to. You don't have to come to me. But I would always prefer that it was a coach, because we're trained to listen for these things and we're trained to help you strategize around them. But it can be a friend. It can be another writer. It can be your spouse. It doesn't have to be somebody that you're paying, because the important part isn't having something at stake monetarily. The important part is the perspective. You usually can't hear your own basements and balconies because they're about the fundamental assumptions that you're making when you use these strengths in context. So let's get into the two examples, because I want us to hear the process that we go through as coaches, or that I go through specifically, because I can only really speak for myself, but the process that I go through to identify when someone is operating in a basement and what it sounds like, the questions that I ask, how we get down to what's really going on. I want to show you a couple of examples of this so that you can see the process and then hopefully replicate that for yourself and or someone else. And of course, understanding that these are examples that may or may not be about strengths that you have. So the point isn't to be able to say, here's a list of those behaviors, because as you'll hear, the behaviors are sometimes very deep underneath what people are saying. So let's get into the examples. We're going to start off with activator. Now, at its best, activator is an action catalyzer. That's the core of that strength. It's what activator is best at. That means that when activator sees or hears an action point, they want to act right away. We kind of joke around a little bit around the activator strength that they are ready, fire, aim, right? It's the aim is not before fire. It's not ready, aim, fire. It's ready, fire, aim. And that the joke there is the action happens so quickly, sometimes there isn't an opportunity to aim. So if you're listening, sometimes the basement of activator is acting completely without aiming whatsoever, having no thought as to what the outcome will be, right? That impulsive behavior is an activator basement. But knowing that is about having heard people talk about their difficulties. And so let's go through one of the very common, very, very common stumbling blocks of high activator writers. So let's say that you're a high activator and you have 30 covers or 100 stock images sitting on your hard drive that have never been used, because every single time you see a cover and you want to buy it, you buy it before you've even thought about whether you want that particular cover for the long term or not. It's the idea you have of, wouldn't that be cool? It leads so quickly to, let's hit the buy button, that there's almost no space in between those two things. Or the flip side is, every time you have a new idea for a book, you go out and either have a cover made or you buy a stock image. And so you'll end up with this pile of potential ideas. Or another way this manifests is the first 3 chapters of a book that you've written that you've never gone back to, right? Like activators often have a stable of sometimes hundreds of unfinished first chapters or first 3 chapters of novels that they've never completed, because what they're really, really good at is that initial firing of the, here's the idea, let's act on it. Here's the idea, let's act on it. So we're asking ourselves, when I'm hearing someone talk about this, I'm asking myself as a coach, and I usually ask them these questions if they haven't already told me, because sometimes they tell me without realizing it. Now, in order to evaluate whether it's a basement or not, we have to know some things about that particular behavior of collecting images or collecting covers or collecting openings to books. The first one is, does that collection create stress? Are you stressed out by the sheer number of covers you have that you've never written? Do you think you should be writing all of those books, and therefore all of those books are creating stress, right? They're pressing on you. And I want to say it doesn't create stress for everyone. For some of you, it does. And there are reasons for that, right? But it doesn't create stress for everyone. And I've seen a lot of activators who do this, and they just, the book covers or the beginnings or whatever, they just sit there and they don't think about them, so it's not stressful. So this is a really important question to ask. Is the collection creating stress? And stress might be evaluated on multiple levels, right? Does the constant creating of covers and constant opening of books keep you from writing other books? Like, there are all kinds of questions that could relate to that stress question, but specifically about the collection, that question is important. So if you answer no, then I usually will leave that alone. But if the answer is yes, it's creating some stress, then I move on to the second question, which is this stress causing a depletion of energy pennies? So for instance, if you're an activator and you get bored with the book that you're writing, are you always going back to this folder of new shiny covers and getting distracted by how cool it would be to be writing a book where there's no resistance? And that idealism sets in, right? Like, the idealism is common with the ideation, sometimes with strategic, with activators. Like, there's a lot of idealism that happens there because of positivity, futuristic, or some more that do that. Is that idealistic image of the book with no resistance creating stress for you because you keep going over to these covers wishing you didn't have resistance in your current book instead of working through the resistance? So is the activator causing you to deplete energy pennies by having to draw yourself back all the time to this book you don't want to work on because it's causing resistance? And you have to exert that willpower a lot. So if the stress is causing energy penny depletion, then it's more likely that it's a basement, right? So the more you're getting stuck, the easier it is to get distracted by this new idealistic thing. On the other hand, if it's not causing depletion, and for the most part, the covers just sit there on your hard drive, then we keep asking questions, right? But if the answer to that is yes, and we're getting closer to, like, if you think of the flags, the first one is yellow, the second one is orange, is probably a basement, and the third one for me is red, right? This is definitely a basement. And this question is there ever a time when this behavior is beneficial other than the moment when you're indulging the impulse? Because in the moment when you're indulging the impulse, it feels great. Oh, we got a new cover. It makes me feel so good. I'm so excited for this new idea, right? Or, oh, I started a new book. You're not going to believe it. It was so fun. So other than the indulging of that impulse, is there a time when it's beneficial? And if that answer is yes, then let's deal with the stress from the first two questions and not assume that this is a recurring pattern that you need to deal with, where it would be like a basement level designation. If having the covers for some reason provides you with comfort, then that might not be a basement behavior of like epic proportions. It's still an orange flag because you've said yes to stress and yes to energy penny depletion. But if it's keeping you from writing and it's not causing some other kind of benefit, or if it's causing a lot of distraction because you keep getting pulled back to it and there's no benefit other than indulging the impulse, then we have to have a discussion about a basement behavior strategy. So let's look at one more example. Let's say you have high restorative, and let's say you have a habit of listening to all of your friends who are having emotional issues. Of course, because you're restorative and you can see the problems when they present themselves, you can clearly see the way they could change their behavior and you want to fix them. So there's no space between I see the problem and let's fix the problem, right? That can be a balcony of restorative depending on how it acts. Just like a balcony of activator can be turning thoughts into action depending on how it acts. So then, is this behavior of restorative a basement? Well, let's see. So that, is there stress caused by it, right, is the first question. And we translate that in this case to, do you get emotionally invested in whether or not they take your advice? So do you get stressed out, basically, by whether or not they take your advice? So if you don't, then I'm not sure that we're talking about a basement here, right? Then because it's not causing any negative effects. You're not afraid of how they're acting. It's not stressing you out. So it might not be a basement, right? It doesn't sound like it to me as a coach. If you do get stressed out by it, if you are overly emotionally invested and the expectation that you're holding subconsciously is they see the problem and therefore they should fix the problem, or it's my job to, or it's their job to. So seeing the problem and fixing the problem become equated. Not everybody has the capacity to do that. Not everyone sees that and fixes it as quickly as you do because you're high restorative, especially in other people, right? So that's an unrealistic expectation that might cause a lot of stress or an emotional tailspin, even if it's only momentary. But if you're a high restorative and you're perfectly capable of listening and offering advice and not getting invested in whether they take it or not and whether the advice lands, then this is not a basement that you struggle with. And so you can move on to other things. But if it does stress you out, then we have to move on to the next one, right? Is it depleting your energy pennies? So are you going to look for other people's problems to fix as a way to distract yourself from what is not getting done in your book? This is a big question about the energy penny, is the going back and forth between the manuscript all of the time and having to force yourself to exert willpower to get back to the manuscript. The more difficult it is for you to rein yourself back in, then the more likely it is that we're dealing with a basement. So when you get distracted, are you specifically looking for something to fix? Then that's a good chance that this is creating energy penny depletion for you, that it's making you spend willpower stores in order to get back into the manuscript. And then we probably want to deal with that and we want to target that. But again, that's only an orange flag. So we had the yellow flag and the stress. The orange flag is energy penny depletion. And then the red flag is there a time when the behavior is beneficial, right? So translated here, is there ever a time when you don't go into a tailspin emotionally about how your advice is taken? And if you can think of times when that emotional investment is really beneficial for you, then it's not as likely that we're talking about a basement behavior. But if you can't ever disconnect from whether or not people take your advice, then we're definitely talking about a basement. And then we want to strategically target that behavior so that we can bring you out of that basement. So notice again, the identification of the friend's issue is not the basement. That's peak restorative. Even on some level, giving advice is not even the basement, right? That's also common with restoratives, at least in a benign way, and sometimes even in balconies, depending on what your responsibility is to that person. If you are responsible for them, or if they have given you responsibility, or if you are connected to them in a really meaningful way that makes you invested in their life in more than just a passing manner. If there is a time when this behavior is beneficial and it doesn't send you into a tailspin, and you can easily pull yourself out of it with certain people or certain situations or certain advice or problems, then we want to look at the patterns between when it's beneficial and when it isn't. And this is sort of how we parse out whether the basement is active or whether the basement is related to a certain situation, because that's also important when you're strategically targeting how to develop out of the basement. So I'm going to circle back around to something that I said earlier about the presenting issue. What is it that's presenting? Because usually when people come to me for coaching and we end up talking about a basement, they didn't come to me for basement and balcony coaching, right? They came to me for pain point coaching or unrealistic expectation coaching or burnout coaching. They're here for some other reason. And through discovery, we realize that their pain point is coming from a particular basement. In this case, the most common way that I see this is the activators or the ideation activators or the strategic activators are coming to me because they're overly distracted and they can't seem to finish books. And so then we have to talk about, why aren't you doing that? What is holding you back? And that's when we start getting down. But the presenting issue wasn't, hey, I think I'm in an activator basement. The presenting issue was, I'm getting distracted. I'm not finishing books. I can't get back to the manuscript. What's going on? And then we get down to this targeted sort of basement conversation based on this rubric of questions. And so that's why I say this is not an easy process, and it's not something you can just list a bunch of behaviors, because if I were to say to a high activator, um, one of the basements of activator is too quickly catalyzing thought into action. That's so abstract for them. It's like, well, I'm sure I do that, but I don't know where, and I don't know what that looks like, right? Because it's a very abstract thing. That's why when we do the Strengths for Writers talk shows, I have 3 very different writers on there, all talking about how the strengths manifest for them, because it's the specific resonance of the behavior and the language that they use that'll make you feel like, that's me, that's what I need to do, this is handleable, this is doable, this is my strategy. That's why it's so important for this perspective to be part of the discussion, and not just for you to get this list of things and then go randomly work on them. And this is also why I encourage you to ask questions on the YouTube, on the Patreon, in the Facebook groups. I am a huge fan of reaching out and asking for help, because that perspective can often be the thing that shifts us into recognizing, oh boy, this pain point's actually coming out of one of my strengths, and I probably need to work on that basement. And I apologize for the abstraction of that concept, because it's such a big picture concept, right? But then how we get down into the little nitty-gritty details of that is different for every person. And so I have a couple of things that I want to end with. One is that obviously we didn't talk about the targeted development for these things, because the targeted development is different for each person. And one of the ways that I go about deciding how we're going to do the strategy that we're going to work on that will target that basement is, what's the specific behavior? For some people, it's whenever I get distracted in my book, I automatically go to Facebook, and then I'm in all these cover groups. For other people, it's when I get distracted, I go to Shutterstock, or I go to Period Images or something to search out images, because that's how I soothe myself when I get frustrated. And then that's the source of where all of the images are that you could potentially buy. For other people, their ideation activator strategic is so high, they can't not come up with new ideas. And instead of having a decision tree for how to handle those new ideas, they just immediately catalyze that action. And so it's the having of the ideas with no way to evaluate them that is the difficulty for them. So every single person's basement behavior, even in something that's so similar, they're all very different. And this is why I say that conversation and perspective is so important, because you want to make sure to talk to somebody who can address the specific actions that are happening in your life, because it's not a generic thing. And I know that's my individualization talking, but there's just no such thing as here's a generic plan for how to develop your balconies and basements. It's all super specific. So you can use these questions, you can use this evaluation to be able to help yourself find those places. But once you get into how do we target the development, that's a much broader question. That's something that has to be asked almost in specific context with yourself. This is why I say in the second season, we're going to be doing much more work with balconies and basements. My hope is to do some actual live coaching with people with the different strengths, so you can hear, oh, here's how we identified that, here's how that goes, or to have a discussion of someone who's been through the coaching. The other piece is we're going to start offering more long-term development programs to follow up the cohorts, where in the strengths class, you get a one-on-one with a coach. And then in the advanced strengths class, you get 3, because we do your top 5, 6 to 10, and full 34. But you get all these one-on-ones as part of those cohorts, but then we don't have this ongoing thing other than the communities, which are discussion only, and they're not coached. But they really need to be coached. And so we're going to start offering that. We have at least 2 more people getting certified by Gallup. They're going to go and take the training at Gallup this year. And so we're continuing to add more and more coaches into the stable, My goal is to find people who are already writers, just because I do think that's an important part of what we offer here, as that's different from just being a strengths coach, is that we're specifically locked in and targeted to writers. And so that's the second piece of what is coming to help deal with this more. If you do have questions, please come over to the Patreon. We do a lot of discussion over there, and I know some of you get sick of me saying this, but it's really important to be connected with people who know this language and can talk about it if what you want is to get to that point where you're coming out of your basements and you're hitting that standout spot. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who commented. Because we are releasing the podcast on Monday this week, we are going to close on Sunday night the 2 giveaways that we did last week. There was one on the YouTube channel, there was one on the Patreon, the public Patreon, not the private version. But there were 2 giveaways. We are going to award both of them in the comments on those posts, and you will be contacted if you're a winner, because we have email addresses for everybody. So thank you so much to everybody who was part of that. The big news with me as well is that the Burnout book, which I think you can see behind me somewhere, but it's the purple cover. So the Burnout book is releasing on September 17th, which, if you're listening live, is tomorrow, is Tuesday. And so that book is going to come out. The reception from the beta readers and critiquers has been phenomenal. And I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who put time into reading that and into discussing with me and into helping with that process happen. It was huge. It was a huge undertaking. And it really has been about 4 years in the making, because of course, part of what I talk about in the book is coaching all of these writers through burnout and the burnout that I went through myself. So it's been a labor of love. And thank you all so much to everybody who helped with that. And I really hope that it's helpful. And so there should be a link to that book, to the pre-order if it's Monday, and to the live book if it's after that. But there should be a link to that in the show notes this week. And then, of course, I will be at NINC on the week of the 22nd to the 29th of September. So if you're going to be there, please come and find me. I love to talk to people who've watched the quick cast or who've read the Burnout book. And thank you so much for all your support. And if you have questions, please ask them below. And otherwise, I will see you in the next quick cast.